One of the parts of the scenario is that this strike, devastating as it is by North Korea, this bolt out of the blue, and it leads to a U.S. retaliation that is not designed to end the world. Certainly, it's designed to end North Korea in response, but it's misinterpreted by the Russian military because of its satellite readings, and because, as you point out, another shocker of an endless stream of shockers, to attack North Korea means overflying Russian airspace with our missiles in retaliation, and that is what ends up triggering the unleashing of the Russian arsenal against the U.S. arsenal against Russia, and the end of the world. Can you turn to a favorite of mine, one of our most experienced and brilliant scientists in the U.S., a true rocket scientist, Ted Postal at MIT, who describes the fact that we count on a level of precision to understand what is and isn't being attacked, to try to keep something under control that is unmerited. In other words, things can escalate absolutely out of hand, not because of an underlying real attack, but because of a misperception of what an attack is.
That's right. And Ted Postal, professor emeritus at MIT, was extremely helpful in helping me report the book. And he and Garwin have written numerous papers on the threat of a bolt out of a blue attack from North Korea, and numerous things that they advise could be done have not been done. But it was Ted Postal who pointed out this precarious reality having to do with the satellite system. So we spoke earlier how powerful America's satellite system is, that can see the hot rocket exhaust on a missile and identify it in the first fraction of a second after launch. But what we haven't yet spoken about, and what you are bringing up now, is the flaws in the Russian systems, in the Russian technology. And of course, no one likes to admit that their technologies are flawed, so they pretend they're not. And again, I sourced this with Pavel Podvig, who is kind of the Western world's expert on Soviet technology, having, studied in Moscow. And he confirmed with me that this is a fact, that the Soviet systems, their satellite systems that are looking at ICBMs, are flawed. They don't have what is called look-down capacity, so they can sometimes mistake clouds or sunlight for exhaust. Coupled that with what you pointed out, the most frightening reality of all is that in the event of a counterattack, so if North Korea were to strike America with one nuclear weapon, I learned that our response would be approximately 82 weapons on North Korea. Wow. We would level North Korea. We would turn it into a fireplace so as to take out its nuclear command and control, its ability to launch any more nuclear weapons. That's the theory. But in doing so, were we to launch ICBMs from our missile silos in the Midwest, they do not have enough range to strike North Korea without flying over Russia. Which means you would have to assume that Russia would just accept, those missiles that are going to come, those are going over you, they're not coming at you. I mean, even imagine if we were best friends with Russia. That would be a hard pill to swallow. Imagine at a time of enmity. And, as a journalist, you wonder...
As you point out in the scenario, the tensions are so high that there's no trust. And so the communications immediately break down, in effect, when the president isn't there to make the call. It's all very realistic, knowing that even without war, these two governments are not talking to each other properly at all.
Yes, not at all.
When you have minute to minute and the only issue is survival or not survival, the idea that you're going to establish trust suddenly after years of animus, of proxy wars, of lies, of cheating, And it doesn't happen, of course, in this scenario. In the end, these missiles are misinterpreted. Russia thinks that it's under attack from the United States, rather plausibly, I would say, and there is no control.
And that is why the result is the full-scale nuclear exchange, which is precisely how the systems were set up.
One thing that you mentioned, again, I have to say to the readers, of course, you need to read the scenario. It's so riveting. Or do what I did, which is listen to Annie narrate the scenario, because it's probably even more powerful that way. But you describe various war games that have been played, nuclear war games or nuclear escalation games or conventional war games that have the potential for nuclear escalation. And one of the absolutely harrowing, but again, for me, quite believable points that you make is that all of these war games somehow seem to end up in relentless escalation. Could you tell us what you learned about that?
Yes.
Many of these are not explained in public. We don't have our generals saying, my God, it's out of control. We have to turn to the diplomats. We don't hear that at all. But you learned a lot about what has been found in the simulations, and none of it is heartening, frankly.
Absolutely. I mean, these are incredibly jealously guarded secrets, the nuclear war games, and yet they are played regularly. They are run regularly. And we have only one known example of a full 2-week-long nuclear war game scenario whereby multiple scenarios were run. It's declassified. I print a page in the book, and, it demonstrates that no matter how nuclear war begins, whether NATO is involved, if NATO isn't involved, if China is involved, if China isn't involved, no matter how it begins, nuclear war ends only in one way, and that is full nuclear Armageddon. No one in the Defense Department will doubt that. No one has come forth and said, actually, I learned of a different scenario. It is just it is unimaginable that this is what all of our nuclear command and control knows and has known for decades. And the public, essentially, we have been kind of running around like the ostrich with the head in the sand, the neck exposed, not really knowing the dangers. And when I say
I think they lie to us, frankly, or they don't tell us, they don't treat us like adults. That's my view of it, which is tell us these things. They have our lives in their hands, and I don't feel safe, and your book didn't make me feel any safer.
Well, it ebbs and flows. We have to give a little bit of credit to the past movements to disarm, right? So, as it was pointed out to me, in the 80s, people were protesting in Hyde Park.
Yep.
People were protesting in Central Park.
Absolutely.
And so this groundswell of momentum coupled with what I call the Reagan reversal, whereby Reagan decided not to no longer see the Soviet Union as the arch enemy, but rather as the adversary. And that is, interestingly, because of a ABC television movie he watched called The Day After. He saw the film. He wrote in his White House journal that he became greatly depressed.
Wow.
Actual fact. And
Wow.
so there is hope because, he was a nuclear hawk. And I'm so happy you're smiling because it makes me smile too, to even think that that kind of perspective reversal is accurate. And it is. And he reached out to Gorbachev and said, we must reverse course. And the world went from the all-time high. In 1986, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons. Today, there are approximately 12,000. That is the direction in which we must travel.
But, it's an amazing fact. And of course, I remember Helsinki, and we should recall that when Reagan and Gorbachev met in Helsinki in 1986, I believe it is, not only did they strike up a personal rapport, and I I loved Gorbachev personally and found him one of the greatest statesmen of our age, maybe the greatest, because he was a peacemaker, and Reagan had the same feeling. They almost reached an agreement. Okay, we've got to get to zero. We have to eliminate nuclear arms. Then it seems the aides ran and said, no, we have to get these leaders apart. You know, they're going to do something reckless if they agree with each other, because serious people know we need the nuclear weapons. And they rather pulled them apart from what was potentially, truly the decisive turn to denuclearization, which we should recall is actually a commitment of the nuclear powers under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it recalls another period in time, which I've studied, and I wrote a book about it now 11 years ago, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. President Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev felt we must pull back from the brink. This was the most harrowing, awful, close call of humanity imaginable. And they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in the summer of 1963 because they reached out to each other on a personal level. For me, it does say something about the power of the human connection if our leaders would talk with each other, if they would discuss with each other, if they would realize in that way our common vulnerability. This craziness of war games that escalate to the end of the world might start to penetrate more deeply into our actual policymaking.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more that the fixing comes from the people. The fixing comes from the ability to reach out across the aisle and have a conversation. You don't have to love them. You know, I mean that in a you know, you don't have to even admire them. But you have to move, as Reagan did, from seeing someone as the enemy. I mean, the enemy is a militaristic term. The enemy is who you kill. But the adversary...
Absolutely. And Annie, you know, in 1963, in my favorite speech of the modern presidency, which was Kennedy's speech on June 10, 1963, calling for the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, he not only did not call the Soviet Union the enemy, he said, we have to admire the valor and the culture of the Soviet people and all that they have done in science and in the arts and in defending us and being an ally with us in World War II. And that respect at the height of the Cold War was one of the personal motivations for Khrushchev. He called the U.S. envoy in Moscow, Averell Harriman, and said, that was the finest speech by an American president since Franklin Roosevelt. I want to make peace with your president. And a few weeks later, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty.
A brilliant example.
Yeah, it's and the Reagan and Gorbachev and one of the things that. Yes, I was going to ask you, if I may, just to put a parenthesis around this topic. You know, one of the things that was also not understood or revealed to the public for decades afterwards, not even properly understood, was that in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, after Kennedy and Khrushchev had arrived at the deal of mutually removing weapon systems, missile systems pointed at each other's land in proximity in Cuba and in Turkey, respectively. After reaching that agreement, a disabled Soviet submarine, thinking that there was a war going on over its head, nearly launched a nuclear-tipped torpedo, which in my understanding, under U.S. military doctrine at the time, would have unleashed the full force of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, maybe a world ender at that moment. And it was one person, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, a person unknown to almost everybody in the world, who saved the world by countermanding the Soviet submarine captain and said, no, you're not launching that weapon. We are going to rise to the surface and find out what's going on. We're not going to inadvertently start World War III. And that order prevented the firing of the nuclear tipped torpedo. So I wanted to ask you, in your research, you must have heard about close calls or mistakes or misjudgments or the potential for them, even aside from a bolt out of the blue, just an apparent bolt out of the blue on the radar screen. And I wonder if you could say a bit about that also, because that one terrifies me, knowing how there's always a Murphy's Law in this, but Murphy's Law to end the world we shouldn't have.
Absolutely. And there are like 4 or 5 or 8 examples on the record of such near misses. So you can imagine how many have happened that we don't know about. But I did learn one. I try or strive to get the first, the first-hand witness, someone who was actually there, who is telling me the story from their own point of view. And for that, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry told me a near miss he was involved in. He was on the night watch with Jimmy Carter, and it would be up to him to tell the president if he had to launch a nuclear war. And the call came from the Pentagon, from the bunker beneath the Pentagon, and said, there is a nuclear attack coming at Washington. And it wasn't just ICBMs, it was also submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And they said, you must wake up the president, and he must give us a counter strike. And as Bill Perry sat there, thinking to himself, formulating his words, and by the way, he told me this story, just a few years ago, so he was reflecting decades earlier. Yeah. And I could hear the intensity in his voice all those decades later. And what Perry said happened is, just as he was about to wake up the president, the second call came. And they said, it's a mistake.
Oh, never mind.
Mistake. And by the way, it was registering not only in the bunker beneath the Pentagon, but in the bunker beneath Stratcom in Nebraska, because those two computer systems are connected. And as it turned out, someone had inserted a training tape, a nuclear war training tape, into the machine, and it was playing. And what Perry said to me was, it looked real because it was designed to look real.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh, where do we go from here? Where do you go from here with this, Annie? It's so powerful. It's so terrifying. We have one war in the Middle East with at least one of the countries, Israel, nuclear armed. We don't even know. Possibly Iran has or could soon have nuclear weapons if it's attacked. We have war in Ukraine, where the U.S. and talks about defeating Russia. Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, has revised its nuclear doctrine, saying that this is our fundamental security, and we reserve the right to use these weapons if our national security, our fundamental security of our homeland is at threat. And yet there's open talk of striking deep into Russia, many things that seem so provocative, it's hard to imagine. And we seem to live with this. A couple of days ago, before our conversation just now, as we tape this conversation, a lead story in the New York Times talked about preparation for the next global war. And I wrote to a New York Times reporter saying, thanks for writing the story, because I won't be able to read it afterwards. The world will end. There will be no paper the next day. And the reporter said, yes, my editors took out some of the caveats, and the Pentagon doesn't really want this war, but my editor removed that sentence and so forth. Unbelievable, the drumbeats of war with nuclear adversaries all over the place.
My final thought on that is this, and I end after I take the reader through nuclear winter from the scientists who wrote the nuclear winter theory, updated for the modern era. I end the book.
And just to say, the nuclear winter theory, maybe you could just summarize it for 30 seconds for people not familiar with it.
Well, after this full-scale nuclear exchange, you have fires burning and burning and burning. Each nuclear weapon will ultimately create a firestorm that is between 1 and 300 square miles. There will be no one to put out the fires. And so all of the United States will burn, the cities, the bogs, the forests, and all across the world. And what happens is some 330 billion pounds of soot will be lofted into the troposphere, and it will block out the sun's rays. And without the sun's warming rays, our agriculture will fail. And I take the reader through this bit by bit. We also get into the radiation, the lack of the ozone, the path of the bugs. There will be disease. Whoever is left, it will be just like Nikita Khrushchev said, the survivors will envy the dead.
Yeah.
But at the end of all of that, to your point about these drumbeats of war, I end with a thought I'm echoing from Carl Sagan himself, who brought this up decades ago when the nuclear war theory was originally written. And he asked people to think about, and I asked people to think about, that perhaps the enemy, and not perhaps, almost certainly, the enemy is not necessarily China or Russia or Iran or North Korea or us. The enemy are the nuclear weapons themselves. And I think that could be said about all weapon systems and all war as a fundamental. They are not.
We have as a real expression of that, a new treaty, a treaty to prevent nuclear weapons, a treaty basically to end nuclear weapons that countries all over the world have signed on to, a new UN treaty. The initiative won the Nobel Peace Prize, but so far, no nuclear power has signed. And so the world is saying to these nuclear powers, our lives are in your hands. You have to stop. The people want to survive. They want their children to survive. They want their grandchildren to survive. And we have to reach those that are holding the weapons, the scientists that you interviewed, the generals that you interviewed that write these manuals, to say this madness is so dangerous. So many accidents, so many misunderstandings could trigger the end of the world right now, not to mention the hot wars that we're in. We need a different course.
We absolutely need a course.
Yes, and your book will play a huge role in that. And I want to encourage everybody to read it, Nuclear War, a Scenario. But I also want to say your whole body of work is interconnected, eye-opening, and mesmerizing. One anecdote to close, if I might. Operation Paperclip, your 2014 book about the end of World War II and the scramble by the United States to take Nazi scientists, many of them who were engaged in shocking war crimes, into the U.S. to develop weapons against the Soviet Union. One anecdote blew my mind, Annie, and that is when the missile designer Wernher von Braun, who became the chief scientist of our space program, in fact, I think soon after coming to the United States, after having created the bombs that bombed Britain using slave labor, terrible, terrible crimes brought to the U.S., one of the first things he does As you describe it, and I had no idea, he sends a letter to, I don't know exactly who the recipient was. Hey, why don't we put a nuclear weapon on the top of these rockets? He invents the concept of the intercontinental ballistic missile. A Nazi war scientist, within months or a year or two of the end of World War II, is concocting the weapon system that can end the world. And America is eager for the uptake. That was amazing. How did you find that, by the way?
Thank you for noticing the militaristic threat, because, of course, I think these are core to people's personalities. And I think that you are always going to have the Werner von Brauns of the world, disguised as scientists. They're just militarists. And then that must be balanced out by the people who want to see the end of nuclear weapons, who believe that a different way of life is possible. And I think that if I can add to that through the narratives I write, I'm happy that I'm doing my job.
Annie, you are doing your job, doing it magnificently. We have been speaking with Annie Jacobson, author of Nuclear War, a Scenario, an absolute must read for our time, the most important book for our time. It is terrifying, it's riveting, it is precise, it conveys an essential message. We need a different course to get rid of these weapons. They indeed are the enemy. They are the greatest threat to our survival today. Annie, thank you so much for joining Book Club with Jeffrey Sachs. I'm most grateful. I'm sure all the listeners are most grateful for your work and for the conversation today. Thank you so much.